Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in September 2024. And we have my good old friend, Simon Wardley of the fame of creating the Wardley maps. And we're going to be talking to a whole bunch of different things. We're going to cover the APT. But one of the areas I really would like to explore is the Gen AI capabilities on Wardley maps to make it scale, right? And again, Simon, welcome.
Pleasure.
Sessions.
Oh, well, we've already covered, we've already talked about landscapes and how we reason and think about things and the impact of AI.
Yeah.
And so we've basically covered the subject already. So I'm going to
No,
say
well, so
it was,
the
but this was in the
like
warm-up call, which we forgot to record. So how are we going to replay that? I mean, gosh,
yeah.
terrible.
Well, so the one of the areas where I feel that, for me, always was lacking in the Wordly maps, scalability, was
Right.
the ability to use it every day, right? The ability to customize its materials to the particular audiences, right? And for me, the big paradigm shift when I was trying to learn the Gen AI was I realized that because the Gen AI creates an intermediate representation of the prompt, right, or the context that you send to it, it's very good at translating, and it's very good at transforming it to a particular audience. So I think, and now I'd like us to go in the Wordly maps, right, into the different elements which you have. So we start first with the map, where I think we're now very close to being able to create maps dynamically, maps from data that we provide, maps that react to the audience that you have in front of it, and maps that we can now use much more effectively to communicate messages.
You sound just like those CIOs I talk to who say we're really close with Gen AI to be able to point it at a legacy code, and we press a button and suddenly magically we've got nice new fresh code and everything works perfectly.
Well, no, but that's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is that,
I've been using, as I said, large language models for. I was using AI before we've had the recent sort of heavily using AI back in 2018, 2019. And of course, since we've had all the ChatGPT stuff, and yeah, we're getting there. Think of them more as they're useful assistants, in the same way they can be useful assistants in writing code, but they'll get things horribly, horribly wrong. So if for example, all right, so if I go, let's have a look, learning and development. I'm just going to share a screen just very, very quickly, which I can't because you've disabled sharing screens.
Oh, yeah. No, you should be able to. Sorry. Yep, you can.
Can I now share a screen? Right. Yeah, so fantastic.
Yeah. And Nick, feel free to again join in.
Okay, so if I this is Glamorous Toolkit, something I use all the time. It's I work with a company called Think who do some amazing work actually. So I'm just going to click a new page. I'm going to go say space technology or something like this. This is like a notepad and a knowledge base and all this sort of stuff as well. So really cool. And I can do live coding and everything else, and it's all dynamic, but I can also create Wardley maps in here as well. So there we are, create a Wardley map. There we are, there's a snippet of a Wardley map, not very interesting at the moment. I'm going to create nodes on a topic, and I'm telling it to use AI. So, because it's space technology, create me a map of space technology, focused on launchers, with 20 components. I should never do this live or anything like that, but there we are.
This is the way to do
there we
it,
are, and press the button, LLM in action, blah blah blah, and we wait just a little bit, and it will just populate a map within it, and of course, then we're into the interesting part. So let's see if it. Oh, look, it's created a map. Let's just accept all the propositions. I don't know what the propositions are. Let's expand this out. Just have a look. What did it create? Propulsion, supply chain, environmental monitoring, communication systems, recovery system. It doesn't really have any users, or it's not really a chain. It's probably got things slightly in the, well, it's got lots of things in the wrong order, etc. but it's a good starting point
Yeah.
in terms of it throws you a couple of things out there. If you were going to take this and go, oh yeah, that's definitely our map, God, yeah, terrible. I mean, that would not be a good place to be. It'd be a bit like, you know, throwing it some a legacy system and just go hoping you can press the magic button and suddenly, hey presto, it's created you something beautiful in Rust or whatever it happens to be. But it's got things like recovery systems, navigation systems, good payload integration, launchers. Well, there's no way that launchers are in that sort of custom built. They're heading way more over here. There's loads of things you'd want to change, but it gives you a starting point. So, and one of the things I do like about actually this particular tool is I can actually go and start challenging things on the map itself and get it to interrogate different components as well. But let me talk about, because it was supposed to be about
By the way, we have Tudor on the call here.
Oh, Tudor! Well, God, there you are. There's me doing a terribly rubbish sort of discussion about, you know, what I like about glamorous talking. You really should do actually, Denise, because you know there's fascinating way of thinking about and interrogating problems, which is this whole space of moldable development and glamorous talk here. You should definitely do a session. Can I just make a plug for doing a session with Tudor? Hello, Tudor. Right. So on that note, because you said we were going to do APT, and I thought, gosh, APT, what are we going to do in that space? I had to think about it, and there were a couple of things I came up with. So I'd like to quickly run through those. And they do connect to mapping, and they also do connect to your AI space as well. And the three I want to talk about is perspective, reason, and landscape. Can you see, by the way, my toolbar at the bottom, or is that hidden?
That's hidden.
That's hidden.
Oh, fantastic. Good. Right.
Is that good?
Good. So I'm going to talk about all three of these, and we'll start with perspective. So, do you remember I used to talk about the chess game?
Yeah, the playing chess.
So, a wonderful world where everybody plays chess and no one has ever seen a chessboard. Okay. And how well you play the game determines your ranking in this world and all the rest of it and blah, blah, blah. So you start the game by simply seeing these icons on a screen. And because I'm white, I get to go first. It tells me I can press the pawn one or the thing which looks like a horse, okay, the knight. And so I press one, and it says pawn, and then my opponent has a go, and they press pawn. There we are. And then I have a go, and I can see I can move any of those, right? So I press pawn again. That was really interesting. And then they press queen, and then this game goes on for ages and ages and ages and ages until somebody wins, okay? So what will happen is over time, as we collect thousands of those games, we'll start to find secrets of success in it. So if white presses pawn, you should respond with king. And if they press pawn again, definitely go for a bishop, or we'll write books about the power of the queen. Now you should just spam the queen button all the time as a way of winning the game. And then what will happen is, unbeknownst to you, you will play somebody else who sees something magical. They see the board, and you don't know there's a board. So you press pawn, and they get the board piece move, and they press pawn. Right, okay. And you press pawn, okay. And they press queen, you've lost. And it's like, wow, what happened? This is like some super magic secret of success. You're scribbling this one down, you know, pawn, queen, I'm going to use that. Isn't it fantastic? Blah. And of course, every time you play against this person, you keep on losing. And you just can't understand why. And the problem is that you're stuck in this world of secrets of success. You don't actually understand the landscape, and they actually have much higher levels of situational awareness because they can see the landscape, and so they're more into context-specific play. So I want you to imagine, okay, you're still stuck in this world. You don't understand the board. You're playing somebody else. They're white. Okay, you know this secret of pawn, queen. Okay, and they press pawn. And you're like, oh, I know what I should do here. I should press pawn. Maybe I can use my super secret success. But what you don't know is, in fact, you're in one of 16 possible games because any of these pawns could have moved. It's not that one. And so you press pawn, and what you don't realize is you're in one of 256 possible games now. And they press pawn, and you're like so excited because you know now I'm going to press queen and I'm going to win. But you're in one of 3,840 possible games, of which when you press queen, only 1 in 15,000 will give you the win.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens is you press queen and it doesn't work for you. And you're like gutted and all the rest of it. And what you discover, this problem becomes vastly worse when these games are longer. So you just fall into this trap of believing it's not predictable, it's a complex system or something along those lines. The thing is, if you play this entire sequence, it should give you the same result, except for the fact that you're missing the context in terms of the position of pieces. And so in which case it doesn't give you the same result. It gives you one of, in this case, of that entire game's trillions upon trillions. It's an absolutely astronomically large number. So it feels like it's completely random. Of course, once you get to the point of understanding the environment, the underlying environment is still complex because you've got two players. Now, the reason why I mention this is the way you get from one to another is through investigation. It's through understanding or learning, experimentation. It's through that process of critical thinking about the environment. So challenging what we know about our environment. So that's the first thing, perspective. It's really, really important to challenge perspective. It's really important to investigate. It's really important not to just jump to conclusions of it's a complex system. We can't understand it. But then there's something else.
But actually, so I can ask you a question. If you
Yeah,
go
of course.
Back, if you go back to, and I have to say, I always like that analogy because I think that analogy is spot on in a lot of different ways, right? And I sometimes feel that, I sometimes even, I feel like some players are playing chess and the others don't even know they're playing chess, right? Now, my question to you is, I think that there's an interesting opportunity here to, in a lot of scenarios, to reverse engineer the chess game, i.e. the board, i.e. in this case, we knew there was a chessboard, but imagine that we didn't. Now, you introduced a little variable here that I don't think we should have, well, that changed a little bit, which is you're saying the pawn moves a bit in random, right? But let's assume that
that's always been one of the key things. And actually it's to your advantage because you know that there's 1 in 15,000 probability. If you play this sequence and you start to discover that 1 in 15,000 times it actually works, you can start to infer understanding if you bother to investigate it, as long as you're not in this sort of like it's complex, we can't understand it.
So even taking that analogy,
you can start to pull out signals which you'd have to do a lot of play, a lot of modeling, a lot of asking questions to eventually you come up with something which gives you the same probability function that you're starting to pick up.
But surely the formula is to figure out what does the chess game, the chess board looks like, right? So the reality is that I think what's interesting in business and in the way in the future that we're going is that we are going to be able to create those board games, right? That visual representation of reality based on observability. So
let's get now into reason then, because you're going into we'll just ask an AI and it will tell us. Okay.
No. So this is the thing, this is the difference. I want to use the Gen AI to help to not just create the board and explain the rules of the game. Right, so not to give me the right moves, because ironically, I think Gen AI could actually play that game. I don't know if you probably should try it because you probably could, but I think what's interesting is using Gen AI to deconstruct and then using the human in the middle to figure out what those chess boards actually look like.
It could if it had played an enormous number of games. If there was that volume of information of those sequences, it could start to, and so the argument being that you're giving is that it's picking up on patterns that we may not be aware of is perfectly reasonable. But
and in the real world, that's what happens.
There's another issue. Another issue here. This is where we get into reasoning. So we start thinking about, well, AI can potentially help some of these perspective things, and absolutely true. help us create different views to enable us to investigate and question.
Yeah.
Most importantly, for us to create new questions.
Correct.
I mean,
Exactly.
and to investigate space. But okay, so back in 2018, I mean, AI is, as we said, a broad set term. I mean, you can go back through the history. It was all becoming sort of late product at those stage, or various aspects were, and we knew it was going to head towards more of a commodity utility. Certain aspects of the AI space. The AI space is a big space, and large language models is just a subset, of course. And the reason why that was interesting was back in 2018, we were also talking about coding environments and FinOps and serverless. So we'd stopped quite some time before that, stopped talking about the underlying infrastructure, Kubernetes, and the shift to cloud. We were much more talking about the runtime becoming serverless, the change of practices, etc. And so what became interesting was when back in 2018, we used to talk about FinOps, and though we didn't quite have the term FinOps, so it was gaining some traction. And these new AI thingies combining together to form new practices. And that's where conversational programming environments that we talked about came from. And then Alexander, a good friend of mine, we'd had this conversation. He went and built one, which was presented at AWS reInvent 2018. So it was a system that in this case, you had a conversation verbally with, and it would build you other systems. So it was several AIs trained on the APIs of AWS. He'd also trained it in terms of coding. And so he had the system you could talk to, and now it would ask you a few questions and build a system and deploy it for you. And there's some wonderful videos out, very early stage stuff though, but really interesting. And so by 2022, you have like large language models, all that's and heading towards large multimodal models. Those conversational programming environments we like call co-pilots, really, pretty standard fare. But what's interesting is the toolset, is a change in toolset. And what I mean by change in toolset is we're moving from one, we have large tool vendors, we have standard ways of sort of like coding, to one which is much more conversational.
Yep.
So this goes all the way back to Nicholas Negropon's work based upon the work of Jonna Freeman, Architecture by Yourself. So it was all about the design process being a conversation between multiple different minds, sometimes in the head of one or multiple designers. And what's changing is one of those designers, one of the participants in the conversation is now the machine. And that's what conversational programming was really all about. But obviously that requires a different type of language, and prompts now, because we've got memory, are a Turing complete language, and prompts are a conversational language itself rather than the other forms, including declarative. So you've got a change of tool set and a change of languages. But what is also interesting is you've got a change of medium. So very much when we think about code and we think about code as text, now, particularly with the development of large multimodal models, I mean, your code, it can be images as well. So the seed to what you want to build could be an image, for example. And why does that matter? Well, if I go back to a lot of the mapping stuff that I do in research, this is a map of coherent city transport. The code on the left creates the map on the right, so they're identical, but they're just different representations of the same space. The thing is, when I'm talking about the stuff on the right, I'm talking about objects, relationship, and the context that exists with it. Whereas if I'm talking about the stuff on the left, it's all about rules, syntax, and style. And you see this in engineering departments. There's a different conversation that occurs on the screen to the one that occurs on the whiteboard, even though they're talking about the same problem. So why is that interesting? Well, what you've got is changes of tool sets, changes of languages, changes of medium. And unfortunately, fortunately, I should say, how you reason about the world around you depend upon tools, medium, and language. So if you change those, you literally change the way somebody reasons about the space they exist within. And that creates a problem. That problem is we're either going to hand over that reasoning to a specific set of companies or maybe gatekeepers that trust me, I know what's best. And they will be literally defining through guardrails or whatever it happens to be how you reason about the space around you, which is, it's a bit like, imagine the printing press and language and paper was all controlled by a particular group, and they could, I mean, it'd be terrifying. On the other side is you can say, well, it all has to be open. And I mean by open, all symbolic instructions, which obviously includes training data, because training data is symbolic instructions in this world. But of course, we've got all the lobbyists running out saying frontier AI, isn't it terrifying? So we have this wonderful world that we're going into. So I love the AI stuff, but the thing you have to also be cautious about is who controls it, because that changes potential. Well, that changes how you reason, and what you don't know is what values they've embedded within their space. So this is a lovely. Do you know which game this is?
No.
It's Doom.
Yeah.
It is Doom. Why do you think I
that-
put up an image of Doom?
Is this the AI that people
Yes,
think
perfect.
plays Doom?
No, it's the one that creates it. So Google did it's 20 frames per second. There's no gaming engine or anything else. It's just basically it's an AI which responds with the screen according to your movement and actions with the cursor's keyboard. And so the entire game is there. You can play the game, but there's no gaming engine. It is just the model. Okay, it's all embedded in the game, in the model. Do you know which game this is? Actually, easier. Do you know which design studio produced this game?
I'm not into games, so I'm not
No?
the best one to answer this.
All right.
Kind of am, but I can't name it.
Right. The design studio here is Hezbollah. And this is a game called Holy War. Hezbollah, produced a AAA game. So why do you think Hezbollah produces AAA games? Is it because they're big fans of gaming? Or maybe because they're embedding certain values and beliefs and other things within the game, and they find the games as a medium, as a tool to influence others? So the problem here you've got is this is just, and the first one, Doom, is just the model. This particular game, Holy War, has not been converted into that model, but it could be. So, but it's the same principle. How do you know what are the values and beliefs that are being embedded in the systems which enable you to reason about the world around you?
Well, I actually think that's a really powerful area of research in the next couple of years, which is how do we start to understand how the models actually
That
work?
might be too late, by the way.
Well, it's already happening, right? So a lot of those horses are already gone, right? But I feel that we will need to understand much better how the models work and how they arrive at some of the conclusions they have and what's inside of them.
Okay.
And I would say, if you look at the Wardley maps of understanding of how a model works, today we're very much on Genesis, but that's bound to evolve. We're bound to become better at understanding it. Even using your analogy, I think in a lot of the models, we're at the stage where we only see the moves, we see the numbers, we don't see the chessboard. Right. I feel that in the medium term, what we want to make sure is we start to figure out what does the equivalent of the chessboard looks like for that models. And this is where I feel that there's also an important part here, which is I actually want my models to be more as deterministic as they can. And there's some models where having that kind of hidden stuff on it becomes bugs, or you need to start understanding there's a problem on it. So maybe that's not the models that we want running certain things.
Okay, so I totally agree. We don't have the technology and the capabilities at the moment to truly understand why a model gives a specific result.
Yep.
Okay, it doesn't exist. Part of the issue that we also have is that the symbolic instructions are not just the code, but also the training data, because the training data consists of images that change the behavior of the system. And a lot of the training data isn't open. So we don't have the models at the moment, A lot of the training data isn't there anyway, so I'm not sure how we're going to infer forward. So what we're hoping to do is like you see the Doom equivalent game, it's coming out of a model. We somehow work out what the value is based upon that sort of output that's coming from it.
Mhm.
We don't know how to do that at the moment.
I agree. But that's
Okay.
like that stage where we have the moves, we haven't figured out there's a chessboard on it. But I feel that that's a really interesting area of understanding and research. But I also feel that there's models that we want to use in the future that give us that versus a model that doesn't. And I also feel that, so I'm trying to do a lot of stuff which I call deterministic Gen AI and provenance. And I view the ability to understand how a model arrives at certain outputs and the ability to map the intermediate steps and to
Right.
visualize all that as
So-
the feature that we want.
So start with a perspective. We're in this sort of lazy world where people can simply go, "Oh, we don't
Yeah.
understand this. It's complex." Where in
This works.
fact we need more investigation. The underlying system may be complex, but there may be levels of a landscape and a rules that are there that we could understand. But in order to do that, we have to have that investigation. We have to have the ability to critically think about a problem.
Yeah.
But now we're going into a world where our ways of reasoning about a space in terms of tools and medium and languages could be, we may well be handing that over to others who may embed their own values and beliefs within the system, whether deliberately or not. Okay. And in order to cope with that space, we also need to be able to critically think about the space and challenge it. By the way, critical thinking is not something that we teach at schools. I wish we did. All right, so now let's talk
if you
about.
just bring quickly Tudor on this is that I see the thing that really, when I look at your moldable stuff, Tudor, which I found super fascinating, and I think we arrive at, a bunch of us, I think arrive at the same sort of conclusion in different ways, is that I feel that creating the tool is not a side effect, is like, again, it's part of the journey. So I feel that in order to achieve what we're trying to do, Simon, on this sort of how do we visualize the models, how do we understand the models, how do we control them, how do we get really good outputs, our tools have to be moldable. We have to be developing these tools driven by the human who asks really good questions, and then it's like tools on tools. And what I really like about a tool developed with the Gen AI element is that in the past, we had to code everything, where now we can let parts of it be a prompt or a model, which allows us to scale much more the customization of the tools.
Don't disagree in terms of, like, for example, when I started off with Glamorous Toolkit, did a Wardley map, got a large language model to create me basic one of space technology, then I interact with it. I can use it to challenge things as well.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting thing about moldable development is the speed at which you can build tools. Okay, so it changes. It really is. You go from a world of 15,000 people have 15 tools to try and understand a space, to 15 people have 15,000 tools, one for every single question. So it's a fundamental way of is a real challenge to the assumptions that we've had around tool sets and everything else. But unfortunately, we are walking into this world of tool set, medium and language, potentially controlled by a few players. So we're going to have to do some challenge on that. We need a bit of a rebel alliance. We need a bit of open in that approach. Otherwise, they will be dictating, how you think about it.
I don't think we,
but
to be honest,
hang on, because we got to get, because there's a third part. Okay, it's not just about critical thinking perspective, and it's not just about how we reason. There's also the question of landscape. So if I think about territorial landscapes, and this brings us a little bit back to the APT space, I mean, we use maps for determining our territorial sovereignty, where our collective with our values exist within, what's our border, and, who are the others we maybe conflict or cooperate or collaborate? And those are all three different types of competition, okay? And we do this all the time. So this is a map which was done in 2015, DVLA. It was to do with the automotive industry. We were looking back in 2015, we were predicting forward to 2025 using a map, looking at what happens when we have self-driving cars, how they become more commonplace and all the rest of it. What are the possible things that might happen? And we talked about the people would come in with digital subscription models for these things to do with infotainment, etc. Sure enough, I think it was BMW, Mercedes did that about 2021 or something. But we said the real danger, particularly from a government perspective, is you're going to get digital subscriptions linked to route management. And I think it was either BMW or Mercedes, one of the two, put a patent in place for this. It's a really daft idea. And that idea is simply, you're driving along in a car, you're a gold member, everybody else is bronze, it's all self-driving cars. So all the other cars get out of the way so you can get to your journey quicker because you're a higher subscription. And this is embedding of social inequality into the transport system, which of course, if we have a flood means a whole bunch of poor people don't get out and the next day we have riots. Right. So one of the things we learned with the maps is when looking at other nations, you could start to see how China was playing the game in terms of strategic investment, particularly around industrialization of the space. And we started to think about collectives and values. Those values will be embedded in simulation models. Those simulation models will be in the intelligent agent. So an example would be car coming along. It's going to have a crash and kill 5 people or 1 person. Who does it kill? Well, hopefully it kills the 1 person. What if the 1 person's a billionaire and the 5 people are unemployed? Well, it depends upon the values of your culture, whatever. You'd hope it would, but unfortunately, I'm sure it will. If somebody's a platinum member or something. Right. But nonetheless, your culture, we have to, when we're looking at a technology system, what is the border? What is it that we really want to protect? Where are we happy to collaborate? Where are we happy to cooperate? So exactly the same as in territorial spaces. So the question increasingly became, where are the maps, radars, and situation rooms of the technological and economic landscapes? And the answer is, well, we didn't have them. We're starting to get them with things like, or slowly, the ideas of SPOM, software bill of materials. There's some post recently by the National Security Center about the whole field of SPOMs, which is fantastic. I mean, this was a piece of work, not just within the software. We've got massive problems on the physical side. So this is the entire economy of Hungary mapped out through transaction level VAT records. And it's a graph, sorry, not a map. And what they found was there were about 100 companies which were connected to about 70% of the GDP, and about 25% of the GDP of the entire nation was dependent upon 30 companies, any one of which had a problem, you'd lose the whole 25%, which is terrifying, except for, we can't do that. we don't have that. We don't have transaction, so we don't understand the space. So when you start thinking in those terms, you start thinking about governments, what they need, the ideas of sovereignty, and people often use PESL, but political, technology, economic sovereignty. These all depend upon theatres, and those theatres depend upon awareness of an underlying landscape. And so we've got very good territorial awareness in the theatre of, sea, land, air, space, all that sort of stuff. We're very good. But in the theatre of like digital supply chains, we have poor understanding of supply chains and digital chains, which of course connected to underlying physical chains or software chains like SPOMs, but we haven't collected that at the moment. So connecting all those 3 together, I mean, I did and you were actually part of this, Denise, with the security group. I got there's about 50, 60 people together. First of all, they collect a whole bunch of words. You can't see what the words are because it's really irrelevant. Collected a whole bunch of words of what they thought mattered in security, categorized them into themes. Those themes became our perspective. Then we mapped out the landscapes. And then what we did is we looked at investment areas based upon certain values, whether we wanted the market to grow or whether we wanted to improve society. And that was the conclusion, if you remember, at the end. So this was back in May 2023. So if we want to really improve cyber, from a society perspective, beyond just listening to the National Security Centre, and they do some really outstanding work, we have to really focus on things like building a resilient culture, as in getting people to challenge and question things, encouraging that sort of critical thinking. We have to think about cyber immunity. So we have to think about, understanding what our supply chains are, not only in the physical side, which we don't understand anyway, but also the software side. We have to think about what the rapid growth of AI actually means, and not just from the fact of isn't it great to use, but also the fact that potentially we're handing over our ability to reason, or somebody else controls our scope of reasoning, and potentially they embedding beliefs that we may not have within the system. We just don't know. And of course, supply chain awareness, SCM, SPOMs these days, is a critical part of this. And these are all where we should invest. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the market says you should be investing in digital sovereignty nation state actors. And this came from not only the analyst reports, because the AIs are trained on this. If you ask the AIs, they have a massive bias towards the market. So they will tell you, you should be about advanced persistent threats, big problem. Actually, no, leave it to the National Security Centre, provide SPOM information as they need it, focus more on resilient culture, cyber immunity, getting to understand your landscape.
Yep.
But the market will tell you rapid growth of AI. Okay, that's not bad. Process automation, because a whole bunch of people are selling process automation tools around security. Horizon scanning, because there's a whole bunch of analysts selling that stuff. And at that point, perspective, reason, landscape, I think mostly, unless you are in that business of nation state or you're working for the National Cyber Security Centre, the best thing you can do as a company is to focus on building a resilient culture, encouraging that sort of critical thinking, getting people to think about their perspective, and trying to understand the landscape you operate in. How did that go? Did that help?
Yeah.
You gave me a question. I can't help but answer.
Couldn't agree more, right?
Well,
Nick,
I was going to say you didn't see you, Simon. I was there as well at the. I remember how interesting that was doing the Wardley mapping around cyber.
Oh yes,
And
hello Nick. Sorry, pleasure.
No. I mean, because there were so many, which was really good, and especially so many
his beard has gone
outside
also
of
a little
cyber,
bit.
sort of discussing it was really good.
Yeah.
In sort of, I would expect nothing less of you than to sort of attack the question, which you have kind of done, in that organize. And I sort of reached the same conclusions via a different route, in that organizations shouldn't be concerned about APT. It's that understand your landscape, understand your position in it, and don't and just for all sorts of reasons, don't be concerned about those attackers. It's more like you say, especially culture and what your organization can do, what you're in control of, and what you can affect.
But there's a whole bunch of consultants selling those skills and capabilities to you.
Well,
That's the problem.
as we've discussed, it's like it's as we've discussed before, and Open Security Summit before, is just that that kind of approach, that kind of, well, this is what I know, so this is what will fix the problem, is an issue. I especially like the point you make that that's what LLMs are trained on. So you've got all those causes of people have looked at the market and gone, well, this is what we can sell, and this is what people should use, with the backup of, well, this is what LLMs say, and computers are so logical, and they're also, to generalize horribly, computers are so logical, and LLMs are so smart, they generate these answers so quickly, so that must be right. That kind of misplaced confidence, when actually it's like you say, take a step back, and really interested in using game-based analogies, because I think that's the direction I'm going in that this, look at the board, not the moves. Look at as always, look at the landscape, look at the context. So just yeah, that's really useful, really hopefully thought-provoking for people. But also, I'll ask, I don't know whether this is the right place to ask or for you to answer, is how to convince people of that, because the risk to someone to say the way everybody else is thinking is wrong, or
Mm.
the way most of the people are thinking is wrong. How do you do that? Do you need the weight of mapping, for example, to prove to people this is how you do something different, and this is why you do something different?
So again, really, really fascinating question. So that difference between social benefit and market benefit. So when I get these research groups, and they can be 50, 60 people, we'll pick a topic like healthcare, for example, and they'll all be clinicians, or most of them will be clinicians, and we'll start mapping out healthcare. The problem with creating a map is if you ask a bunch of people to go and map Paris, and they come back with a map of Paris, and you say, what's the most important thing in Paris? They might say Pierre's Pizza Parlor, because they mapped it from a perspective of nice places to eat pizza. So all maps have a perspective. So whenever you're mapping a landscape that no one understands, you have to send really multiple groups in to map from multiple perspectives. And then you can ask each group what's important. And then you need to aggregate across all the groups to get that signal, to find the thing, and then you discover that the Eiffel Tower is actually quite an important feature of Paris. So if you do that with healthcare, when we ask the question, what's important, you also have to ask, where should we invest to benefit society versus the market? And you'll get two very, very different perspectives. And so if you want to improve healthcare for society, we need to focus on things like patient-reported outcome measures, sharing of data, because we've actually not got a healthcare system. We've got a sick care system. We're very good at treating symptoms, not making people healthy. We don't even know really what healthy looks like. But if you ask the market, it's all about preventive healthcare, even though we don't actually collect any patient-reported outcome measures, so basic stuff that they're selling, and DIY medicine. Now, of course, the LLMs, because I test this across multiple, when you ask them where should you invest, they will come up with more of a market-leaning answer, because there's more data on the market out there. People aren't analyzing it from the point of view of the landscape and asking that question. So if you start driving policy by what the LLMs will tell you, you're going to have a market focus. Now, the big problem there is that government has to balance two things. One is exclusion, because in order to have a market, in order to trade, we need property, and that's based upon exclusion. So it's my property, not your property, or it's your property, not my property. So we have property laws and we have exclusion. But the other thing that a society values is not just property and exclusion, but inclusion and opportunity. Okay. And so the role of government, you've got to balance both of those, exclusion and exclusion. And so if your policy is being fed by a system which is market driven, mostly focused on exclusion, the inclusion side is going to go to the wall. And this is where, the societies become unstable if it all goes one way, not the other way. You normally have a yo-yo between the two, and it's always a bit of balance of how do we create fairness and opportunity, and also exclusion. So inclusion, exclusion, in order to keep the entire system cohesive. Well, the danger becomes language models trained on this stuff. Now, how do you persuade people on this? Well, you can show them the maps, but you've also got to be mindful of their own biases. You see, unfortunately, some people benefit from a change of the status quo to one particular path or another path. And so certainly, if you went to a whole bunch of large language model vendors and said, look, for reasons of reason and making sure that we don't end up in a new theocracy, all of this stuff has to be open source, including your training data, they're not going to go, yay, totally agree with you. They're going to send a bunch of lobbyists out, persuade government that open source is really dangerous, frontier AI and all the rest of it, because it's out of self-interest. So you really need people in government capable of realizing you need that balance between exclusion and inclusion. And you've got to focus, your large language models, whilst useful in certain spaces, because of what they're trained on, will tend to drive you down a particular direction. And the way to understand that, you can use my forward maps. I don't know another way of doing it, actually, but you need to somehow observe that landscape you're operating in. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, yes, kind of, as in, then it's a case of how do you get,
Oh,
either
we're
how do
just
you get,
doomed, I'm afraid.
well, but that's, I'm trying to avoid that. It's like, you know, the roads are like, how do you get those people into government? How do you make mapping from a marketing point of view is my sort of abbreviation of, like, it makes sense to enough people, or are you looking at like armed insurrection? Like quite serious, because you're like, well, that you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. What options are there left? It's a really interesting answer, and and with, especially looking across the internet, and is like thinking with a hacker background, is what's the hack? What are we missing? What's the assumption
So
that
I mapped out.
Sorry, go on.
I mapped out education, and the key thing from market, the market is all focused about use of AI and everything else in education. From a societal benefit point of view, everything pointed to critical thinking. So, but we don't teach critical thinking in schools. I mean, it's not even a course. It should be a course on par with maths and English. We're walking into a world where we're going to have these environments, these large language models, these various forms of AI, which will do a lot of that reasoning for us. And we're not even, you know, people can't even cope with the current levels of misinformation. They're not equipped with the skills to really challenge and really think about this stuff. I mean, it needs to be in education on par with, as I said, maths and English in the UK, but we don't do it. And I think that's how, if you were going to fix one thing, I'd love to fix PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures in healthcare. I can tell you, we can go through retail, telecoms, about 17 different industries. If there was one thing I would go for, it's critical thinking in schools. I think that for me is the key.
So I'm an optimist on this one. So, and I think we go in that direction. And in a weird way, I think the Gen AI and LLMs are going to make it worse to make it better. And it's the same thing with the whole fake news and creating content, where we need to be much better at provenance. And I think where the information came from, who created it. And I actually think your critical thinking is spot on, because you need both, right? You need that ability to understand. And if you look at education, now that the whole idea of writing an essay and the stuff goes out of the window, right? I think we can challenge that what the education should be providing is exactly that critical thinking, is exactly that ability to understand data, exactly that ability that, you know, how do you process, how do you collect the facts, how do you create logical structures? Because it's now easy to create the other stuff that, you know, we used to memorize things. So I think it's you know, that one I'm more optimistic, Simon, because I think we now have the ability to force that change in teams and in organizations, which are going to fight, like you said, because there's a huge amount of status attrition, like in the Wardley maps, the terminology against it. But I think the forces are so great. I also think the advantages of the people that operate in that level have that momentum.
So I'd love to agree with you. I'd love to be, I think this is the case. Tudor, and whereas you were in the security groups, Tudor was in the education groups. And within the education group, there's a whole bunch of people who worked, you know, professors of education, all the rest of it. And they did a number of maps, and every single map, and Tudor, I'm sure, wouldn't jump in and tell you about this, they always started from a perspective of, you know, at the top of the map is the students and their needs and all the rest of it. Tudor, what happened to every single one of those maps?
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting experience, because we had 3 maps, right? So, and we developed them over a course of 1+ years. So reasonably detailed conversations and study involved in there. And so we started with the first one, and yes, the student was the goal is to, level playing field and help the student, and have the school system be a support of that. So we used 3 different perspectives. First one we start, and then at some point, like what I like about Wordly mapping is that basically it's a medium for you to formulate sentences, and then it gives you a syntax to to put those things on the map. And then we kept formulating. At some point, there were sentences that we could not formulate. Obviously, that's usually a sign that something is not quite right on the map. We turn the map upside down and have, the system be on the top and the student being at the bottom, and just everything falls into play. Like you could start to formulate things that you would see. And I was like, okay, maybe we missed something. So we start with the second perspective, same stories. Third perspective, same story. So it was really fascinating because none of the people involved in that map exercise would have agreed with this starting, would have agreed with that perspective at the start of the conversation. So it's still uncomfortable, but that was the conclusion that came out of it.
So I watched all of the education groups, starting from the point of view, education is all about opportunities and improving the life of students. And got professors of education in that group, and every single time, in order to resolve the questions, they had to conclude that students were right at the very bottom. The education system was serving the market and the education establishment itself. So now back to the question of critical thinking. The problem is the market wants AI skills. And what we're saying is, well, we need critical thinking. And you're basically saying that this is what we need students to do. Well, in order to do so, in order to get critical thinking in there, we're going to have to somehow persuade the education establishment. And actually, it was wider than that. It was actually society itself and various power structures in society, and the market, that critical thinking of the general population is a good thing to have.
Okay, but a lot of businesses are hiring critical thinking, right? I would argue that when I was hiring a lot more, that's what we were looking for. I wish I had called it more explicitly, but if I reverse engineered what we were looking for, it was critical thinking. So I think in that element, there's a level of the market that will buy, that wants to hire critical thinking. In fact, that's the same part of the market that complains that universities and the schools are not creating the talent that we need because we don't get the kids to come out of university with critical thinking. So that part is kind of there.
Are they complaining there's a lack of critical thinking, or are they complaining there's a lack of skill sets to use the latest technology or tools?
Or are they complaining that there's a lack of something we could sneak critical thinking in as, like, if you've got better critical thinking skills, are you going to be a more efficient user of your AI assistants as an employee and therefore make your company more money? Therefore, the companies, and like this is all very hand wavy, like society will encourage critical thinking, and by the back door you've got a whole set of newly trained critical thinkers looking at the way everything's working much more insightfully than people are able to now. So just relabel it. We'll get it done by Christmas.
Tudor.
Just to point out that there were two interesting papers coming out. One a few months ago by the GitHub team. So they were looking at the effects of the Copilot, in productivity. So I can imagine that they were quite incentivized to find benefits, because, and they did find benefits when they looked at it in a very specific way. So they found some, things that maybe would be measured in terms of low-level two-digit, low two-digit percentage improvements, which is kind of interesting. There was an interesting asterisk there saying junior people were more susceptible, were more prone to accept the propositions of LLMs. So the conclusion there is LLMs help juniors for this, right? Which is kind of interesting. Of course, the other way to say is that, so why, if the proposition, because this is not about whether or not, it helps you to upskill, but it's whether or not the proposition is any good. And so the other way to look at this data is to say, well, why didn't seniors not accept this? And so one way to say is that maybe there are two skills. The other one is to say, well, maybe it was subpar. Interesting enough, right? So then, but this comes from them, and then like just a few weeks ago, comes another paper which looked at a more longitudinal side, so a larger breadth, multiple in multiple companies. They get exactly the same results: 20% improvement in productivity, but with significant and by productivity they mean the amounts of things that they accepted in practice, the amounts of things that they committed. And so, which is an interesting way to formulate productivity. I remember a while back when people were measuring productivity by the amounts of lines of code, so incentivizing people to create more lines of code, but they got exactly the same thing. The juniors are more susceptible, more inclined to accept the propositions. Now the question is, we were talking about the subject of critical thinking.
Yeah, but I would challenge that a little bit. Look, I code every day at the moment, right? And I get ridiculous amount of value from the LLMs. Now, if you would measure the value that the LLM gave to me by the number of lines of code that actually were committed, maybe not a huge amount there, but that's not a good metric. So I would argue that you have a problem already with how you measure productivity.
Yeah.
Right. And I would argue that where the LLMs help me a lot is because I would argue that I have a level of critical thinking that I apply to it. And actually I have full on debates, right? And I'm so much with the LLMs and I have so much more productive because I'm able to use it, which I think they're very good, is in the translation, is in the context. I can say, here's a bit of code, find me this, rewrite me this. If I ever do things like, here's the code structure, here's the new formula, now write me this in that structure. So it's kind of like, again, creating those mini tools, which I feel that we now need to productize a bit more, but that's where I think the real value is. On the other hand, of course, right, like with new technology, right? The people in the beginning, they believed everything, well, they still do, right? That comes off the internet, right? So we're going to
There's a
have issues
difference
there.
here between what people believe and what get marketed and what gets marketed.
Yeah.
Because what the market, and this is where this is the slight difference. Is it the individual that is really like really empowered? Is this what we care about? Or do we care about selling, for example, the idea that the AI can actually code?
Well, I think there's a lot of people at the moment that want to
so
sell that idea,
the
right?
difference,
So I think
yeah. But so my question again, like back to the point of that Simon was making, what is the driver? Is it really the improving some sort of quality of something, or is it market forces? And today is just, you can see them at scale, market forces. Because the difference at the critical thinking level is to say, well, it's quite obvious. If you look at the architecture of a large language model, there is no way a large language model gives you an answer. What it gives, it doesn't matter whether it comes formulated as an answer, as a statement. It's always a hypothesis that might or might not be interesting, but it's up to you to evaluate this, right?
Yeah.
It's because interesting that one experiment that I ask people to say, well, ask it twice the same question and see, is it like somewhere in the vicinity? And it's very often it isn't in the vicinity, like the second answer, which is, that's exactly what's interesting for. But that's actually, even if it's formulated as an answer, it's the question that might be interesting. That's what you should be looking for. So, and it is not right now, people want to use it as a reasoning tool exactly to replace the uncomfortable exercise of actually building critical thinking into the population that should be using the tool.
But I think that's the blip where we are now, and I think that won't scale. I think, of course, people are always going to try to do that, but I don't think that's what's going to work.
No, but that's what gets
but like
marketed.
everything, right? With every new technology, there's always people that want, especially when there's market forces, right?
But
So-
again, but the point, I understand that, like with everything, but the problem is we're getting so, like, it's quite clear. There's nowhere, I don't see it anywhere being said, use this one as a way to find interesting answers, because they would have been, in fact, the interesting thing, right, about an LLM is that you have to adjust it to make it look like it gives you an answer to a question. By default, an LLM just completes the sentence that you start. This is what it does without any wrapping around it. It just give like the very first when you were giving the llama versions or the very first open models, they were not having the
Yeah,
wrapper with the chat.
those
They were
were.
just having the beginning, because that's what it does. It's just it gives him the start and gives you the answer afterwards, which is really, really interesting, in fact.
So
But
can
no,
we
it have to be
conclude?
dressed
Yeah.
so that it
So-
looks like it dupes you. Right?
So can we conclude, because I think we're top of the hour and we've
Yeah,
only got
top of
an
the
hour
hour,
and
yeah.
we've probably got, can we conclude the single largest APT to us at the moment is this idea that we can replace critical thinking with AI,
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't put it better.
which unfortunately is what a huge number of executives
it's advanced,
enterprises think we
it's
can do.
persistent, and it's a threat.
No, I really like the idea of LLMs as insider threat, and saying that, like, understanding how that sounds, but also saying that seriously,
Mhm.
getting people to think about that. And also this feels like the start of a conversation, not the end, in just that
Yeah.
kind of contextual thinking.
I literally have that in my presentation where I say the LLMs are at the same time your most vulnerable API because of text. And when you put them inside your data center, connecting to others, they're your worst insider threat. You imagine what will happen when somebody pops an LLM in the middle of a data center and then asks the LLM or the LLM to hack itself internally. So yeah, I think that it's a great phrase. I think there's two elements there, Simon. I think not only the LLMs are becoming our APT, the idea that you can use them to replace critical thinking is in itself an APT.
Well, yeah, I think absolutely the
That's the
replacement of
theme for
critical
the
thinking
next
with an
session
AI,
that we're going to do.
particularly around policy areas and
Yeah.
everything else. I find you're opening yourself to all sorts of things, not only biases towards the market, you don't know what the beliefs and values are, you don't even know what it's really been trained on, none of this stuff is open, you've got no way of interrogating. It's but hey, you can just ask a question, it gives you an answer and it sounds plausible.
Yeah, that's the topic for our next Open Security Summit session.
I look forward to it.
On.
Take care.
Thanks again,
Lovely.
Simon.
Pleasure.
See you then.
Meeting you all.
Right.